Project Mercury was the first human spaceflight program of the United States. The program was initiated by the administration of the heroic and popular five-star general and also former Allied Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the courageous American general who oversaw the victorious D-Day landings and an Allied invasion force that eventually overthrew the evil of Nazism and brought about a complete end to the terrible sufferings of the Second World War. The popular decorated five-star general was subsequently elected in 1958 as the 34th President of the United States, and Eisenhower and his administrators instigated and ran directly the military rocket and not a civilian rocket project of Mercury, the military's rocket project of Mercury, which ran from 1958 through to 1963. It's no coincidence either from the very generals who divided up the conquered territories of Nazi Germany to see the full military potential in warfare from rocketry and missile technologies, particularly in the capturing of Nazi rocket scientists and technicians, the rounding up of them as suspected war criminals, their equipment, their plans and their technology, and the exporting of all of this back to the United States under the guise of Project Paperclip. Project Paperclip, where hundreds of captured imprisoned Nazi scientists and technicians involved in rocketry missile technological development programs were transported to the US to be given new lives and pardoned for their part in a despicable Nazi war crime, along with a new task and role. Though this was now in working on America's as opposed to the Nazi regime's missile and rocket technology projects. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin also saw too the value in this, in taking most of the German rocketry technologies and German hardware back to the USSR, this as his part of the spoil and divvy of an unfortunate German defeat at his hand, and an attempt of global domination through Nazism and Herr Hitler's misguided and bloody-minded view of warfare. Therefore it's as much an irony the very rocket missiles that rained down so much death on the innocent heads of the British populace, the so-called doodle-bugs of chief Nazi rocket scientist designer Herr von Braun, were the V-2 rockets and deadly Nazi missile rocket, and also the forerunner rocket delivery system of the American-led Project of Mercury, though these were later to become respectively known under a far more sublime title as the Mercury Project's Redstone and Atlas V rocket launch vehicle systems. Even less surprising to note is Eisenhower's experience gained as an frontline general and the success of rockets and missiles as a deadly implement of warfare. Particularly since he'd have known full well Joseph Stalin's generals dealt a singularly and crushing defeat to the retreating Nazi armies, making full use of the deadliest, the most feared weapon of the Soviet artillery regiment's arsenal, the Soviet Katyushka rocket. It's perhaps with this in mind that the American Air Force under Eisenhower instigated the Project of Mercury, and not only to catch up with an advanced Soviet rocketry-based science technology, but indeed to actually get ahead of it. Because these were the same Soviets that had made very little effort post the Second World War to gain any type of a strategic air offensive capability, unlike America with its thousands of long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear warheads and the threat of nuclear Armageddon. America promised it could deliver anywhere at a moment's notice, and this at any time. This through NORAD and America's Strategic Bomber Command and its strategic air defenses. Instead, the Soviets concentrated solely on nuclear ballistic missile technologies, this as an adopted skill and expertise they had used to a dramatic and devastating effect against the evil Hitler Nazi regime. Therefore, Project Mercury, the U.S. military Air Force rocket program staffed by former Nazi war criminals and stocked with former Nazi technology, undertook its first task of catching up with the advanced state of Soviet rocket capabilities way beyond any known aircraft of the time, capabilities that put satellites in near-Earth orbit and capabilities that could do the same for men. Understandably, and space-based manned strategic rocket capability was well within the concerns and genuinely in the national interest of the US military and government of the time. However, the pressing need and an imperative certainly wasn't, nor was the technology actually available yet to the Americans to do this. Therefore, Mercury's first goal was to put a man into a near-Earth ballistic path. Quite simply hurl a rocket to its maximum height and let the man and rocket fall gently back to Earth for a soft landing with the aid of parachutes. Project Mercury made no secret of the fact that, starting with monkeys and chimpanzees, men were to be strapped onto ballistic missiles and hurled into space. This was noted by the American public at the time as rather a brave endeavor, and though not seen as ludicrous, it in fact made sense, and brave heroes of the early pilots such as U.S. Air Force test pilot John Glenn, who went on to the later Gemini and Apollo projects, was certainly an ace pilot, and this by any regard. However, despite this rudimentary attempt of spaceflight, Mercury set out a much more detailed plan than was generally publicly known or understood at the time, and in secret developed a project with a 10-year lifespan and clear standard for spaceflight technology specifications, as well as gradual and evolutionary advancement of American spaceflight capabilities. The problem for Mercury wasn't its vision but the clear imperative of national defense issues, with so much an emphasis on nuclear arms, large military budgets and spending, as well as huge global standing armies. There was very little justification for Mercury for the lack of hostility in space, at least that's the way it seemed to the American public at the time. Mercury's extensive and forward-thinking 10-year plan was extreme in its detail and very well thought out in its objectives, but this fell well outside of the military's current theater of operations. Mercury then had to be put elsewhere to form its shape and fulfill its true military functions, since the exponential of space was the real territory for the American-led exploration, and only the very vaguest notions of that prevailed. Also, the technical specifications for manned or unmanned rocketry and spaceflight didn't match that at all of ballistic missile technology. Meant Mercury needed a manufacturer if the military's plan largely held as secret, where to take its form and its fruition. Therefore, a federal agency had to be formed to house the Mercury project, but this agency was to lay out the military ambitions and objectives of Mercury and not serve as some kind of government scientific or research establishment-led project, but with more clearer goals of space domination, conquest and exploration, and any potential for America's national security or its defense-related objectives. Thus, part of the American-led anti-Soviet, anti-communist propaganda of the time was to try and first convince an American public, and this was to be done through the means of the press, that a race in space with the Cold War enemy the Soviet Union was on, though the Soviets never once publicly stood up to this challenge, and the sheer scale of space exploration and its extreme environments and difficulties quickly made a mockery of this ideal in time, as the many later joint efforts of the Soviet and US space alliances to follow would readily testify. However, this didn't prevent an hostile anti-Soviet, anti-communist American House and Congress to convince and concern an American public enough to find the fund for the Mercury project, which later ran into the Gemini and Apollo programs, as well as staggering public demand and an extortionate bill for billions of the Americans' taxpayers' dollars, and this for civilian programs which had long since departed far from the evolving Mercury vision of space missions and objectives, the visions which Eisenhower, the generals and the military had cautiously set out many years before. Project Mercury in its initial costings had put forward fairly conservative estimates for the evolution of American space missions which were identical to the Gemini and Apollo ones in everything but the project's name, but costed these far more ambitious plans well below the outlay of the latter civilian-led projects of Gemini and Apollo, as well it proposed far more radical and far more forward-thinking alternatives to the much applauded Apollo manned moon landing missions. Therefore, a federal agency was formed with a specific aim of making a reality of the Mercury blueprint. Thus the National Aeronautics and Space Administration (NASA) came into being, and a long list of American defense aeronautic and aviation contractors, McDonnell Aircraft, North American Aviation, Western Electric, chosen specifically for its communication expertise, as will the American Chrysler Automobile Corporation and the American aviation contractor Convair. These contractors and many more civil corporations were all lined up as the prospective contractors and manufacturers of a civilian-based rocket project that was to perfect and utilize existing ballistic missile technologies for use as America's space exploration vehicles. However, just like the Mercury project, NASA was no different and still remained under the direct control of the government. Though its formation was sold to the public as a relinquishment of military control and involvement in America's early space programs and an handover of this as a civilian entity, but the reality of NASA was there was no technical compatibility in present ballistic technological hardware, therefore no possibility of direct military involvement. That is to say, if America were to get into space, then it first would have to develop the rocket-based mechanics and hardware to do this. However, despite this apparent and public losing of the military's control, Mercury's and the later Gemini and Apollo programs still remained firmly in following the evolutionary principles of the Mercury project, and project that was way advanced in its thinking and ambitions. As an example, Mercury had already thought out well before the moon landings of possible manned planetary explorations, and this would almost certainly be in the hope of gaining territorial rights to any habitable planetary bodies, this even though international agreements in place had forbidden the territorial claims of any nation in respect to the planets which were now said to be easily within the reach and grasp of mankind. However, the generals and military men who formed Mercury would be well aware of the Soviet Union's ambitions of the time, with Soviet planetary probes to be sent to explore the territory of Mars and Venus. It follows if a claim on the territory wasn't to be made or held and respected for international agreements and the United Nations position on this, then nevertheless at least the means would certainly remain and in actual fact still be in place to do this. NASA, or rather Mercury, had such plans in place well before the 1969 moon landings, and it's doubtful whether Project Mercury would ever have undertaken that particular mission, as it had little to be gained in the exploration of a planetary body which was widely known and respected to be so hostile to human life. Mercury's plans for manned landings on planetary bodies, though not necessarily the moon, looked nothing like Apollo's. An example being an early Mercury plan included the construction of an unmanned mission to carry all the required hardware to support a manned planetary landing, though this was proposed to be sent to the body of exploration well in advance, and this was to be done by remote-controlled means. A manned follow-up mission carrying the men and crew was to rendezvous and then, from the equipment already in place on the chosen planet, have the men and crew engineer and construct the escape route and subsequent Earth return mission. This is part of Mercury's evolutionary planning and an ideology of habitable planetary missions, as opposed to the choice of Apollo of its simple set of one-off manned excursions and Earth returns. This method of exploration as employed by the Apollo moon landing missions was the cause of much debate and public argument, with many strongly, particularly within NASA, opposed to the Apollo mission for its lack of foresight, having little to follow up on post the landing, and this can be said to be true as no man has returned to set foot on the moon following the cancellation of the Apollo program by President Nixon, who coincidentally served as the vice president to Mercury's chief planner and initiator, President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Apollo was brought down finally by its public unpopularity, seeming as quite pointless beyond the singular and publicly applauded victory of placing men on the surface of the moon, as will the spiraling and rising costs of the missions, that to some within the establishment of NASA, the government, the House and the United States Congress seemed an actual fact to lead the Americans and its flagship space programs to absolutely nowhere beyond the moon, and this was the major and the specific difference in Mercury's and Apollo's approach to the American space program, that the evolutionary ideology of Mercury had been abandoned in favor of one-off media and public relations exercises, as Mercury had already planned well in advance for an ability to place men on any planetary body that was said to be within its grasp, but this with some form of human habitation in mind, even if that were temporary or unprolonged. Apollo could only manage a period of hours of human presence on the moon, and these excursions to this body beyond any reasonable hope of human habitation eventually cost the American taxpayers some $24 billion of direct taxations. This was seen by some as an extreme waste of America's resources, and this would never have been satisfactory for the project of Mercury as laid out by Eisenhower, the generals and the military, particularly if you follow its evolutionary principles. Project Mercury, whose every step in planned American manned and unmanned stellar exploration was to quite simply follow another. The logistics and mission dynamics of Apollo for Mercury would never be said to be suitable or indeed economically worthwhile, and be that the moon to be considered, or indeed any otherwise planetary body that could be said to be readily within its grasp. And it's telling also today to recall President Dwight D. Eisenhower's departing speech as being ousted from his presidential office by a group of talented young and ambitious politicians who knew full well how to use the media and press to suit their own political ends, and this to hammer home to an American public a strongly biased, strongly anti-Soviet, anti-communist message which would resonate easily with America's preconditioned public that the heroic, much-decorated five-star Second World War General Eisenhower had let them down and presided over an ever-increasing missile gap between America and the Soviet Union, and had also allowed for the loss of face and America's prestige as having failed in a space race, and race incidentally that never was in reality ever on, as will their promise post an election victory, of course, that American superiority in space and all other matters would be settled and the American pride be solemnly restored. Presumably Apollo could achieve all of this with its one giant media event for an eager global audience and one giant and singularly costly exercise for an American tax-paying public, along with one giant headache for NASA if you follow today's presently fashionable moon landing conspiracy claims that pore over every mission detail no matter how insignificant they may seem. Eisenhower's departing speech on leaving office gave the electorate fair warning on the military-industrial complex. So you can't honestly say the good president didn't give fair warning. Perhaps he really did know something the electorate didn't.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.